Hi, everyone, and welcome to the launch of Dr. Koen Slootmaeckers' new book, Coming in Sexual Politics and EU Accession in Serbia. My name is Meg Poff. I'm a first-year PhD candidate in international politics here in the city, being supervised by Koen. So the format of this evening's events, I'm going to introduce our panelists briefly, then we are going to move on to a discussion by Koen of the book. Then we will bring our panelists into conversation with their thoughts, interpretations, conclusions on the book, and then we will end with a little Q&A. But before we get started, a little personal note to Koen. So we met in 2020 when I essentially cold called him with an idea for a PhD dissertation, to which he responded really graciously. And here we are 3 years later. And as I'm preparing my own research in the Western Balkans, people constantly approach me, sharing with me their appreciation for Koen, his work, and his friendship. I'm similarly grateful to have him as one of my supervisors. So Koen, thank you, and congratulations on your book. So, our panelists. So we have Dr. Indraneel Sircar, who's a lecturer at University College London. His research explores the impacts of Europeanization on governance, and the rule of law in the Western Balkans. We have Dr. Francesca Romana Ammaturo, who is a professor of sociology at assistant professor. For now. I wish I was a professor. Future professor, perhaps. Assistant professor of sociology at Coventry University, who explores the intersectional politics of LGBTQ rights and social movements. And then finally, we have Dr. Paul Copeland, who is a reader in public policy at Queen Mary University of London, whose research focuses on the political economy of European integration and the EU-UK relationship. So we will begin with Koen, who I will let give his own, perhaps, little introduction of himself.
I'm always a bit struck as how to start this conversation. This book is, I guess, about 10 years in the making. And so for me, it feels like a personal journey, an academic journey. And I'm incredibly happy to be able to present this book and talk about it with a set of friends who've been part of this journey since the beginning in many ways, and have been people I've been talking to. I admire their work and been talking to, engaging with, and they've pushed me, challenged me in many different ways of how I think. And I honestly don't think the book would have been what it is if it wasn't for you. So I'm really pleased that you're here today. And so, yeah, I'm really getting emotional. I'm just starting. But I think when I look back at kind of my journey, 2013, when I started as a PhD student at Queen Mary, under the supervision of Paul, actually, I kind of look back and I think I was a very naive scholar. I think I had grand ideas of how I thought everything worked, and lo and behold, 10 years later, I think, what the hell was I thinking? But I think the biggest personal journey is not necessarily about how I think about things, but more the confidence I gained in my scholarship and of who I want to be as an academic, rather than being an academic because I wanted the kind of career and the progression, or whatever it is we call a career. I become more confident in the politics I want to embody with my work. And I think that to me has been the biggest journey. And I think the book is really a nice kind of testament to that journey, and kind of brings it forward. I found my political voice and with that also my academic voice. And I think even though like a lot of these politics were part of my thinking 10 years ago as someone who always had inclinages with post-colonial thinking or critical thought, it's always been part of kind of the backbone of my thinking. I feel like I found a way of bringing it forward and talking about LGBT rights in the Balkans through that lens. And with that kind of background, I don't think I want to go too much into all of the nitty-gritty of the book and the story of what happened in Serbia. I'm very happy to talk about it in the Q&A. I probably will hint about certain things that happened in between the talk. but I rather talk about the things I hope this book is doing, the things I hope this book is contributing to academia, to politics, and what I hope it will live on to be once, because we all know once a book exists, it's start doing its own work and it becomes its own kind of object that creates new ideas that are independent of my own writing. So I'm hoping, I guess I will talk about what my hopes are for the book and what it does rather than the journey of the research within it. And so I think I started this project thinking, okay, I want to study the EU enlargement process and how it impacts LGBT rights in the Western Balkans. And when I said I'm a naive scholar, it's because I, at that point, perhaps naively thought that the EU was something good. I'm not saying that I don't believe in the EU per se, before people start saying I'm a Brexiteer or whatever. There is... but I think what I'm trying to say is that that kind of naivete has been outgrown because I start seeing, and I think I've kind of started to describe my work more and more as I'm trying to uncover the 50 shades of grey. And yes, that is really intended to sound as it came out. But I think it's trying to kind of unpack the complexities that are happening and kind of raising some warnings about if we are too naive, if we are too hopeful sometimes, we become blind for unintended consequences, we become blind for things that aren't working the way we think they should work. And if we keep hoping of what should work, then we become blind to see where it doesn't. So I think my intervention is really about highlighting these elements. And so what I will do in the remainder of my talk, and I really have no idea how much time I still have left, so I hope Meg will be nice to me, is talking a little bit about the things I feel quite uneasy with in academia, in scholarship, in the literatures, my own thinking 10 years ago, and how I'm trying to address this within the book. And I think the first kind of element that I want to do in the book is questioning the assumptions we have about what is good and what is bad. The assumptions about where we think LGBT rights have been gained and where they are not gained. Most often when I study LGBT rights in Serbia, the first thing people said to me is, oh, it must be awful there. And it always really annoys me because actually, when it comes to law, Serbia is not doing terrible. And when it comes to lived experiences, there are pockets of really possibilities. And if we keep focusing on it must be terrible, we only allow LGBT people in Serbia to be victims rather than to be people with agency who can also create a life that is worth living, even if it is under circumstances that aren't always favorable. And I'm not here to say Serbia is great, because that's one point that comes later that I will critique. But I think it's really important because it also makes us look back at the EU and the idea that EU is a place of LGBT rights and a safe haven for LGBT people, I think is the biggest thing I feel very uneasy with. We all know it's not the case, and I think the last 10 years have definitely shown how it's not the case. The widespread anti-gender movements that are across the entirety of Europe. People like to single out Poland or Hungary, but we see similar movements happening in the UK when it comes to trans rights. We see it happening in France, we see it happening in Belgium, we see it happening everywhere. Right? So this idea that EU has these rights, to me, I think is wrong. And then the expectation, therefore, EU can bring its values from somewhere else where these values don't exist is a wrong assumption in how we approach research. So I'm trying to destabilize that notion by actually challenging it and saying, well, actually, a lot of the equality principles that activists in Serbia are working towards are their own ideas. They aren't taught somewhere in the West to do this work. So I think I'm trying to really destabilize these kind of ideas to prevent us from falling into these tropes of where we make ourselves to be the good people who go and rescue the gays somewhere else. And I say, they use gays loosely here, mostly because I'm talking colloquially, and usually my political correctness goes outside the window. But I think the intent and the message is clear. Another kind of thing that annoyed me, and definitely over the last couple of years, which is more in the academic realm, is what I call a bit of a stagnation in the theorizing of EU enlargement and Europeanization. I feel we are talking about the process using techniques and ideas and theories that are dated from the 2000s, the early 2000s. And even whilst we are trying to tweak these theories along the edges, we're not actually challenging, are they doing what we think they are doing? The process of EU enlargement has changed fundamentally. Or at least the way they use talking about and trying to do it has changed fundamentally. And therefore, I think we should also change the theories. We need to think more, okay, what are the LGBT rights and fundamental rights doing in this process? Not just as an ideal the EU is trying to push onto Canada countries, but also as a political project within the enlargement process that is creating certain boundaries and these ideas of what is good and bad and defining what is the EU, which has its own consequences. So I feel we need to challenge our theoretical tools to be able to see the politics that values are doing within the process and what this is meaning for LGBT people within the Balkans or other places. And so in my book, I think I really tried to rethink the process from a different angle, probably also bringing my sociological roots into the theorizing to try and bring out the complexities within the process and stop having the black and white kind of assumptions that are there. Another thing that I feel really uneasy about is the fetishization of rights. There is such a strong focus on if rights are achieved, progress exists. And one thing I have learned in my 10 years of researching the Balkans is that is the biggest lie. And I think we don't even have to look to the Balkans as a place where everything might be complicated. Look back in our own backyard. And when I say backyard, I mean this country, right? The laws aren't the protection. They aren't actually meaning what we think they are. Yes, they are important, right? And don't expect me saying, laws are not important. They do important work, but they're not a measure of progress. I think laws are a baseline condition, but if people can't use the laws to fight for a better life, because the circumstances are such that if you stand out and cry discrimination, cry hate crime, you'll be subjected to more violence, then what is the point of laws? And I think that's the one thing that really kind of come forward, and this fetishization of laws and symbolic actions like, oh, can pride happen? Is there a lesbian prime minister? As, oh, suddenly progress has been achieved, is blinding us for where progress isn't happening and how it doesn't produce change for the people on the ground. And I think that is what I really also try to do in this book, is thinking about, okay, we have these changes in laws, prides are allowed to happen. There is a lesbian prime minister in Serbia, who I think is, where it's live streamed, who I have severe questions with. But I think what I really tried to push forward is look beyond the laws and say, okay, what does this actually mean for people? And I think that's one of the contributions I'm probably the most proud of my book, is really pushing the boundaries on what is our scholarship, to really center people in the analysis rather than institutions. Because I don't think we should trust institutions to fix our lives. Because state institutions, in my opinion, and in kind of my political philosophy that underpins my research, came from oppression. The history of oppression that have led to statehoods is baked within these institutions, and I don't think, therefore, we can always look to them for our solutions and our salvation. So these are the kind of questions I'm trying to pose in my book, and I think really what brings to what my book I think is really about is trying to challenge what do we consider to be progress, and really try to push people to think about if a law is changed, if a lesbian prime minister is appointed by the president who is a semi-authoritarian, if it's not an authoritarian person, why? I think we should start asking the why question. What is the political motive behind any change that is being done? And this goes not just for places like the Balkans, it happens everywhere. Any change is being done to become inclusive, there usually is an ulterior motive, because it's not in the interest of people in power to give away or create more space. So often there is an ulterior motive. We have to start looking for what is happening. And then I think most important is also we need to start asking the question, how did that change happen? If pride is allowed to happen, in what conditions is it allowed to happen? How is it done in such a way that actually the whole essence of pride is no longer allowed to exist? And I think some of you already looked at the pictures that Dawood, who is a fantastic photographer, and I've been collaborating on an exhibition about Europride in Serbia, which after the talk we invite you all have a look at. Really try to can show as well is the conditions in which pride are organized can lead to more invisibility sometimes than visibility. And that you can only discover once you start asking how. Under what conditions are we allowed to exist? Are we allowed to have laws? And I think those are the kind of questions I hope my book is doing. And I think what I really try to live up to myself politically is the kind of politics of Kathy Cohen, a black queer feminist who says that a queer project needs to be continuously challenging an interrogation of power, even when progress has seemed to be achieved. And I think with that, I'll end my probably way too long intervention. Sorry, Meg.
I approve. Thank you for that introduction and for sharing your sort of intellectual journey and what you hope the book is achieving. Oh, sorry. Oh. And with that, we will move on to Paul Copeland.
Good fun with the microphone. Right. Great, thank you so much, and thanks for that introduction. I don't think, having known you for almost 10 years now, as you started off as your PhD supervisor, I don't think you were naive when I met you all that time ago. I think you had lots of energy and enthusiasm, and so and maybe I disagree with your self-reflection on that, because I met somebody who was very eager to make a difference, and it's sort of wonderful to be here today to sort of see the academic and indeed scholar you've become. We've known each other for a long time, and I've watched you grow and develop, and I am immensely proud of you. Quite emotional because you were my first PhD student, and I do feel the burden of talking here today. But I am immensely proud of you, and I think you've done wonderful things, including this book. And the field of EU studies should also feel the same, because when I read the book, I am challenged, and I'm challenged in a multitude of different directions, which I think is a fantastic place to be. And the real sort of beginning of the book, I guess, is this statement or this commission strategy in 2013 about LGBT rights being a key priority in assessing fundamental rights in the process of candidate countries. And I sort of cut my career back in the old enlargements when those sorts of issues were not spoken about, right? So it's kind of news to me in 2013 when that happened. But all of that is really tied up with these constructions of what it means to be a modern state and what it means to be sort of European. And nation states are increasingly defined and judged by their gay friendliness or homophobia. And this, of course, speaks to many of us in the room. We are fortunate to live in a time where we have, I would say, some acceptance and have been able to live our lives. I have seen huge transformation in my lifetime in terms of the rights that gay people in particular have. But they should never be taken for granted, and they do wax and wane. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to say today, I was reminded that in 1922, the Bolsheviks decriminalized homosexuality, only for it to be recriminalized under Stalin in the early 30s. And what that tells us is that rights can never be taken for granted, things do change and the struggle is always there. And that's why I think this research is central. The struggle may never be over for equality, but the kind of research that is conducted in this book draws attention to that. Homophobia is a constant feature of life and is included in daily life within the EU, not just accession states. And how the EU sort of instrumentalizes LGBT rights is both fascinating, but also tells us a lot about the limitations of a rights-based approach. And what I particularly enjoy about the research is that it focuses on that tension between how rights are managed and essentially negotiated between an accession state and the EU. The normative contestation around really how much the EU wants to push an accession country is fascinating. And you pick up on this issue that I lapped up in a sort of academic moment about the relational understanding of that, which, as you I'm sure aware, conceptually was a beautiful thing to read for me. And the book sort of argues that sexual politics are located in this, albeit I will say in a rather simplified form, this sort of negotiated, almost mediated relationship between the EU and an accession country. And that, of course, picks up on the international relations turn, but it within sort of certain aspects of EU studies. But I want to come back to that in a second. But what it demonstrates really is that values are not fixed. They do change, they do shift over time. Sometimes that's a positive thing, other times it's less so. And sometimes the outcome is maybe less than what we would like. And that's maybe something we have to accept and think through how we can get further along that particular road. But academically, what you're doing stands in contrast to my early career, where we just looked at a top-down approach, right? You know all about that. Look, these are the EU rules, go and implement them. Have you implemented them? If you have, you're a good student. If you haven't, we will push a little bit further. And then the daily life on the ground is never really taken into consideration in EU public policy literature. And that's what I say is really wonderful about the book, the lived experience and the everyday life. I know you've had many lived experiences going to Pride yourself and experiencing that, but often that gets lost in the kind of research that we do. And I say that as somebody who was definitely victim to that, well, not a victim, but I've definitely fallen victim to that problem. Legislation then, in many respects, is the beginning of a story, it's not the end, and that's how we really have to understand the EU. The violent opposition to the 2010 Pride not only led it to being banned for 3 consecutive years, but this, as you say, the superficial and inconsistent engagement of Pride by the EU essentially changed that movement and depoliticized it. That's the sort of relational, negotiated process of an EU relationship with an accession state on this particular issue. And of course, you've termed that pride a ghost pride, or maybe window dressing, something that just sort of happens, but has very little substance or meaning or content. So what this leads to then is the idea that laws and visibility are not measures of progress. They just tell us one particular thing. And in my own research, which is actually more focused on labour law, I mean, if you've ever worked in the UK, you will understand that labour law is not only incredibly weak, but its implementation is laughable, right? We don't have a labour inspectorate, and it's very difficult to prove certain things. And that's exactly the kind of point that you are getting at in the book, which is that laws are one thing, but reality is another. The most brilliant sentence in the book for me is, as scholars, we must recenter our attention on the people about whom we write, their experience and their realities, as progress in law without a change in their lived experience remains hypothetical. And I feel like all those meetings we had when you were a student or maybe you were Serbia and I was the EU or something like that, if we want to think about it. all those discussions we had about the everyday life and the value of that, much of which I've never enacted in my own research, I may add, is a really wonderful thing to see, and that makes me incredibly proud because I know the personal connection that you have. I've definitely lost out some of that in my own research, and when I read the book, I actually started to think how I should change as an academic, and that is the power of a PhD student. You know, they come along, you encourage them and nurture them, and then at some point you start learning from that PhD student, and that is one of the most wonderful things, if your ego can accept it, of course. Of which the good news is mine can, just about. But the critique of Europeanisation, and again, it's then one of the wonderful things is we did our PhDs quite a distance apart, although I'm obviously the same age as you, I just want to make that clear. But we did our PhDs on two different sort of enlargement processes. And what you have really done in the book is got this magic bullet to how we should understand EU enlargement around this relational Europeanisation. And what that does, and what you tell us in the book, that essentially tactical Europeanisation is basically an aspect or approach to doublespeak, in which candidate countries such as Serbia show adherence to LGBT-friendly identity of the EU, but domestically engage in political actions that are much more homophobic and constructed within a national identity. The book will take the reader through the adoption of Serbia's sort of anti-discrimination framework between 2001 and 2015, the Belgrade Pride, and the lived experiences of such individuals. And in particular, it was the lived experiences I enjoyed the most, I guess because I'd read all the other stuff before. But everything is wonderful, trust me. And the sort of epilogue of the book provides the most telling consequences of what really happens when you engage in this very superficial aspect of rolling forward and implementing rights, albeit in a very particular way. What the book does is it emphasises the politics of EU enlargement, its relational and transnational nature. It moves beyond the simple domestic impact of EU enlargement and critically engages that relationship between the EU and the candidate country. And it's nice to read something that's critical about the EU that is not wrapped up with Nigel Farage, Brexit, Boris Johnson, and all that rubbish. Because actually, you know, we should be critical of the EU. I appreciate everything that's happened in this country over the God knows how long is awful, but we should never take our eyes off the side that, yes, it is better, in my opinion, to be in the EU than outside, and I've always said that, but you should never be completely uncritical about the EU because it needs to be challenged and it needs to hear what it can do better. And that's exactly what this book does, and I think you get the balance of that right. I sort of had some questions or observations, and I don't feel that you have to answer these questions because I imagine there'll be lots of exciting ones from the audience, and I've got them written down for you anyway here, so don't worry, okay? And I'm sure if you don't get to them, we can talk about it over one of our many dinners. And on that occasion, I promise I will drink, okay? But the book got me thinking about really public policy literature in general on the EU. Am I allowed to say boring about my own field? But some of it is quite conventional. It's what Robert Cox would call problem-solving theory, and I find it very underwhelming. But what was really fantastic about your work is that it got me thinking about my own public policy research and had I fundamentally misunderstood the EU. In other words, do scholars need to rethink this relational idea of the EU, and is not the process of European integration in its entirety relational. If I think about some of the things that go on in employment or poverty and social exclusion or economic governance, this negotiated sort of idea. Are we misunderstanding how the EU works? The second thing is that should we be surprised that the EU behaves the way it does on these issues, LGBT rights, given that essentially, and it's always worth remembering that the European integration is first and foremost an economic project that somewhere along the line tags on all these other things. It's market driven and it has particular priorities. So are we, does this come as a revelation to us that the EU is doing what it's doing? And then the final thing, I just want to push you a bit on your final point in your final paragraph, and that's really about how you get voices heard. We can sit in rooms as academics, listen or experience them it through Pride or whatever, and we know the voices of the people that we are researching into. You say in your conclusion, really, that the solution to getting voices heard is about being more radical. I would say that if it was that easy, we'd all be doing it, right? So I think it's a challenge for us, because if politics is about anything, it's actually about ignoring people, right? We talk about how politics is about power and currency is the power of politics. But I'm quite shocked at how, maybe this is where some of my naivety comes in, how the most pressing political problems are often the ones that are never heard. And it doesn't matter what sort of country you're in or where you are, there is an ability to just ignore. And I think a challenge for us all in the room really is to think about how do we get voices heard and what can we do that is maybe thinking outside the box. And I don't have the answer to that question, I'm afraid. But it has got me thinking a lot about the countless experiences that we as researchers hone in on, and then the limited impact we have because politicians make choices that there are certain things they don't want to hear. Anyway, sort of ramble over.
That's actually a really good
end. Have I gone over?
Yeah.
Right, I'm so sorry.
I saw you got to your last piece of paper.
I think I may have just kept going, if you hadn't. So thank you very much for everything, for being my student, for teaching me many things, and for writing what is the best book I've read in a very, very long time. So thank you. Okay, and I'm sorry for going over.
Interesting. You actually, I have nothing to add.
I'm just gonna start. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I want to thank Koen for his generous invitation today, and I just want to premise what I'm gonna say by sort of connecting the dots between you and me. So I had the pleasure of meeting Koen over another book launch. Correct me if I'm wrong. It was 2016. Yeah. Yes. So for an edited collection that Koen wrote about EU enlargement with other colleagues. And it was love at first sight, in the sense that we suddenly became friends, and we've been friends ever since. And it's been a generous, kind, fruitful, but also stimulating friendship, personally, but also academically. And I think the reason why that happened is because we were both really motivated by that naivety, in a sense, that is not necessarily being oblivious, but it means I want to find out more. I am driven by curiosity. And so I'm going to hold my thoughts and I'm going to hold my beliefs to sort of put it on pause and check whether what I think really holds for that particular occasion. So particularly we bonded over nerdy things such as LGBT rights in Europe, Pride events, because we're both very passionate about Pride events and LGBT rights in Europe. And I think that it's been a wonderful thing for me to see, all of the efforts of these last few years, because I've been knowing you for a few years now, blossoming into this monograph that I think you should be extremely proud of. And I think the best thing that I can say, in terms of that naivety, is that more than naive, I think you got over the years, I saw you getting more grit about, you know, what you wanted to achieve with your study, with your research. So whereas probably when I first met you, the impression that you were very sort of protective or like respectful of the field you were in, you kind of over the years got more of a drive to push the boundaries. And that is exactly what I think is needed in this field. Because as also Paul said, we've been very respectful of our European studies for a long time. This sort of idea of very like reverent towards, you know, this huge institution that is massive, has massively changed the landscape of, you know, our lives. But I think it has to be pushed, as also Paul rightly said. And I think I like the fact that you've given yourself permission to do that. And I think it really shows in the book. And I think that is a wonderful achievement. And for me, it's interesting to read this book also because I have personal connection to the topics we talk to. So as a fellow nerd, you know, this is exciting. It's like unwrapping a present at Christmas. But I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm just going to try and sort of like connect some of my ideas. I'm mostly going to talk, I think, about two things, Europeanization and particularly about pride. So I'm going to start with the concept of Europeanization and, you know, what you call tactical Europeanization. And I'm going to say that I was really excited about that concept. And while we were having this conversation already, I got to think about sort of like, you know, if I were to liken your book or the story you tell in your book to a sort of game, like a board game or a game, what would I liken it to? And so the obvious choice that comes to my mind is chess. Because as opposed to checkers, chess is non-linear, right? You can go back and come forward, you have different options, whereas checkers, you have to push forward in a certain direction. And we know that from the story you told about Serbian rights and LGBT rights, but we know more broadly by other stories about LGBT rights around the world, that it's never a checkers game. It's always a chess game. And so I think in the book, which is a tour de force in the sense that it's so insightful in the way in which you explain all the twists and turns of politics, a little bit like a sort of like a mystery book as well. I think what you really achieved is to show the game of chess, that it was sort of like the tactical element which chess is based on, I think comes really through very beautifully in the book, in the sense that you show why choices were made and how these choices completely changed the chessboard, particularly for, you know, LGBT rights. Now, who's acting on the chessboard and where are the people? Because yes, there are some sort of figurines on the chessboard, some pawns, but, you know, where are the people who are actually benefiting or not benefiting from those choices? So you rightly turn our gaze beyond the chessboard as well, because so far, like very often, what we do, we sort of like focus on that. We focus on the game, and we lose track of what is happening around. But, you know, let me go back to the concept of tactical Europeanization. You use it in particular to sort of describe the relationship of negotiation that candidate countries undertake in order to adopt a sort of pick and mix approach to what they want to do in terms of the facade that they portray outwards towards the EU and then the politics that they do behind closed doors. And it got me to think that, you know, and this is connected to a passage on page 88 of your book where you say that religious community really complained about the fact that, you know, some of these rules about, you know, LGBT rights were not even applied in some of the existing member states. And I thought that was a beautiful irony there, because it got me to think that this tactical Europeanization is not just done, and that's what I think is the strength of your concept, is this concept can be applied way beyond the context of accession and enlargement, because this is part and parcel of what every EU member does every day, in terms of how they mold and plastically decide which aspects of Europeanization they will adopt. And the sort of like connection that, you know, came to my mind is the case of Italy, because obviously, you know, being Italian, it's probably the case I know the best. You know, very strongly different from Serbia for many, many reasons, but Italy performs very well the outwardness, and it performs very sort of poorly the sort of LGBT friendliness within. to the point that it's probably a very good case to understand the hypocrisy, right, of this sort of double speak that you mentioned. So I think this concept has real purchase beyond the context of accession, in the sense that it could really be a concept that can travel across European studies in terms of identity building in everyday life, but also in institutional contexts, in diplomatic contexts as well, the sort of like double speak that countries have to do. So I was really, really excited about that, and I think that is a concept that I will probably use in my own work, you know, because I think it's a brilliant concept. So well done for doing that. And also I was thinking a lot about what it means to be a European today, and I think that the other thing that comes across very strongly, in my opinion, in the book, is that you really sort of show the infantilizing, patronizing layer that exists, that sort of like patina that exists underneath the process of enlargement. This idea of the sort of like wisdom that Europe has about what it means to be modern, what it means to be LGBT friendly, and how badly that patronizing tone translates into domestic politics, which doesn't subject itself to patronizing. We can stretch the metaphor, but we can stretch the argument and go even beyond the sort of like form of neo-colonial kind of, argument if we want to, but we may not want to stretch that far. But I think it's very interesting to reflect on this, and we might want to also gender the EU in a sort of a very masculine way as well. Sort of, very sort of like this father figure that has such a, sort of like wise amount of wisdom to give to the candidate countries. So maybe it's my sociological lens coming in, but I think it's quite interesting, because I believe that, and I might be wrong about this, and you mentioned that the sort of like economic project that was at the core of the European adventure. I think that the sort of honing in on LGBT rights from the 90s by the European Union was partly a response of a slight loss of identity that was happening, and that this sort of like momentum was lost, and then it was a time of stagnation. And I think that was particularly a sort of way to bring it back to the forefront. So what is our mission? What is that we're going to achieve? The problem with that, and I think it's a little bit like when you want to put good clothes on, but you haven't really ironed them out, is the idea that they wanted to do the good work, but they hadn't really thought about how that was going to translate. And also because that created several speaks. Because one of the things I was thinking about when you said, I think it was you were talking about the 2013, or I don't remember now, but the 2013 strategy that established Paul. Okay, sorry. It got me to think, think about the sort of like the big wave of accession of 2007, right? What would have happened there if those priorities had been established back then? So would we have 10 countries where the scrutiny would have been there on LGBT rights? And we see today what's happening with countries. Of course, I don't want to single them out, like Hungary and Poland, and what kind of conversations we would have had if those priorities would have been more organic rather than sort of like sprouting out like mushrooms in the sort of like post hoc decision. It's just just a thought, obviously, and I'm not saying that the situation would have been any better or different, but it's interesting because it's very easy to condemn Hungary or Poland afterwards and say, well, you are now members, but you are not really doing the homework. So I'm just curious to know, in another world of possibility, what would have happened. I don't know, just something came up when you were talking. So I think, in terms of Europeanization is a good challenge. I think it's a good challenge to the idea that also European identity is congruent. And I think that, if anything, the only thing that we can agree on is that European identity is extremely incongruent, because obviously it's idiosyncratic, is sometimes hypocritical as well, and is also constructed on more of a sort of sometimes on a minimum common denominator rather than a real ecumenical approach to identity. But you know, maybe I'm more critical of the EU as much as I'm also not a Brexit here. And also, you know, another thing, and this is part of the question I wanted to ask you, is one of the questions that it's kind of like it's in the in the background, but for me, obviously, as I'm a big fan of studying the Council of Europe, as you know, rather than the EU, I'm very interested in knowing how does the Council of Europe come in all of this discussion, because obviously there is a bit of a competition there between the EU and the Council of Europe when it comes to human rights. So who's really in charge? So maybe that's something that, maybe if you have time, you can think about and you can tell over there. The second thing I wanted to say, and this is probably the thing that excites me the most, is discussions around pride. How much?
A few minutes. Yeah.
A few minutes? Okay, I'm going to be done. I'm a massive, massive nerd when it comes to pride because it's also my field of study. So anything that connects to pride for me is super interesting. And it was really interesting to see all of the roadblocks that were put in place for the pride in Serbia to happen. Now, you talk about the Ghost Pride and how it hollows out every sort of politicization, but also every sort of the sprouting the seeds of political activism and civil society engagement. But then I was thinking, and this is part of my own reflections, that pride driven by capitalism is also been hollowing out that. So we can almost sort of like hold together the two sides of this sort of sphere and see that no matter what is happening on one spectrum or the other, on the one end or the other of the spectrum, effectively pride events are dying because of certain decisions that are taken by actors who are external to pride. So, give you an example. We can think about the trajectory here for pride is that you start with a lot of political opposition and maybe violence, and then the more the event grows, the more it becomes successful, the more you need sponsors, and when you need sponsors, it's going to become a huge, humongous monster that you really lose hold of, right? So is that something we really want for pride? Because, in my own research, I see that monster is dangerous. Because that also depoliticizes people. So is the desire for people in Serbia to get to the point where all the Serbian supermarkets are going to promote pride, or the Serbian banks? So what is that going to do? And so your notion of progress is not just about the laws, I think. It's also about what are we wishing for this pride to become? And so we wish that pride became successful, and it did in many countries. But it also allowed pride to become devoid of that spark. And then things like the ones that happen here with trans rights is a massive red flag for, we have a beautiful pride, which is a massive event, but what are we actually using it for? What is it doing to the point that people are moving away from those prides and they're going to sort of grassroots, smaller ones, rural prides, alternative prides, and so forth. So I think, too much political control can kill pride, and too little political control in the sense that you don't have political control in the sense of you do not have a political agenda, or you do not have an underlying idea of what politically you're trying to achieve, can also kill pride. And also provocation. Should we kill pride someday? Should we get to a point where we want to kill pride because it's become like the, sort of like monster, like the kind of robot that is taken over our life. And another aspect, and I'm closing with this, is pride is also can be seen through the lens of the spectacle. This sort of like, and it got me to think, you talk about the ghost pride, but it got me to think about pride as a snow globe, that you kind of like shake a little bit, and then you put it back. And this idea that it's a beautiful spectacle, is beautifully done, beautifully executed, even when it's a pride done in difficult conditions, there's a lot of beauty there. But it's a spectacle. So the spectacle is not for the people who need it the most. The spectacle is for the EU diplomats. The spectacle is for the media. And I think one of the massive areas where we haven't gone still is the relationship with the media. And I think you mentioned that quite a lot. And I think it's a beautiful and important aspect. So I'm going to close with this. I have other questions, but I will ask them in private because I don't want to take more time. And thank you. And sorry if I've gone over.
Do I get to have the magic microphone? Excellent. Well, I guess I'm last but not least of people sort of commenting on this book. First of all, congratulations on this fantastic book, which is taken pride of place at home and known as the Fabulous Pink Book on my bookshelf at home. I can't say I have as a wonderful sort of origin myth story as either Francesca, but we two were, I would say, sort of fast friends, not nerding out over LGBT rights, more about biscuits and Eurovision, reality programming, reality TV, and the meal deals around the corner from Queen Mary. But we do share some sort of intellectual overlap. As said in the introduction, my own work looks at the interaction or the relational between the EU and the Western Balkans, but more looking at environmental governance, rule of law, including judicial independence, tackling corruption, and so on. And more recently, I've started sort of dabbling, looking at sort of like activism and social movements, the more recent one. So there's definitely a lot of areas of resonance between the work that we've done beyond our discussions about biscuits. So what I wanted to maybe kind of like start with is maybe kind of starting with the bits that are a little less surprising, right? So for people who are students or scholars looking at Europeanization East or EU enlargement in the post-socialist space, some of the things that you described in the book aren't that surprising. So despite the EU spending a lot of money and time and effort and sort of discursive space trying to change things politically, socially, economically, things have been going rather slowly, and they are more like a game of chess rather than a game of drafts. This can be explained by various sort of veto players. There's resistance from local elites. There's shadowy parallel sort of structures and state that, you know, that some of which you sort of like talked about in your book. There's a lack of state capacity. There's a lack of civil society capacity. There's a lack of EU credibility and interest, and so on and so on and so forth. However, what's profoundly, I think, innovative about the approach that you've taken in the book is this relational approach based on transaction rather than interaction. And what that does is it allows for this sort of like a delicate sort of balancing act with all of these sort of like different actors acknowledging the role of the EU while still acknowledging what you were trying to sort of build on, which is the bottom-up kind of Europeanization, and saying, in short, it's complicated, right? So it's about these sort of like, kind of complex, overlapping, again, sort of like stop blurring the distinction between the normative and the rational. And this was your discussion about the logic of relationality, which is kind of umbrella that sort of covers both the logic of appropriateness and consequences. So in a nutshell, I will also quote your book twice because I loved it so much. Yes, don't count a citation, sadly, but I will anyway. So in a nutshell, what the sort of like theoretical approach here is that by considering the EU enlargement processes of negotiated transitions, this new conceptualization highlights that throughout the process, EU policies and norms are defined, redefined, negotiated, and transformed as both sides have to make compromises to further political integration, which I think captures what if that's what the sort of theoretical bent of the book is. But moreover, what the book is about, and this whole idea of things being negotiated and kind of messy and being sort of complicated, is that the two sides, what we call the two sides themselves, is sort of further complicated by things. There's an internal dialogue that sometimes gets lost. That the EU is not a monolithic thing, and it's not a billiard ball. and neither is Serbia. And I think the book is really, really good at sort of like teasing out some of that messiness. Another, I'd say, important contribution of the book is that it approaches this subject of LGBT politics, sexual politics in Serbia, as a series of outcomes in process rather than something where there's an endpoint and European